Yes.
Welcome to another episode of the Tarryn Reeves Show. Today, I am joined by Bron Williams, who is a keynote speaker and author. She lives in Melbourne. Bron, welcome to the show.
Thank you. So great to be talking with you today, Tarryn.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you here. You are such a font of wisdom and on such an interesting series of topics. I'll let you introduce yourself because I always find that my speakers do a better job than I do. So take the floor, Bron. Tell the people, who are you and what do you do?
I loved when you said I was a font of wisdom. I'm saying, yeah, that the giveaway is the grey hair. So obviously been round the sun a few times, but I think that's true. And one would hope that by the time you have got to your last third of life, which is where I am now, that we do have some wisdom. And what I'm currently doing now is really taking 6 decades plus, that's all I am, yes, really, of wisdom and using it in ways that I feel are going to be really helpful for people and particularly for women. One of the most significant events in my life happened in 2012 when I put my hand up with the Salvation Army. I was working with them and the Australian federal government had reopened the offshore processing centre for asylum seekers on both Nauru and Manus Island, and the Salvation Army was given the contract for providing welfare services there. Email went round to the officers, workers, volunteers who would go to Nauru or Manus for 4 weeks. And I put my hand up, not because I had this desperate desire to work with refugees or to work in the tropics, but because I couldn't think of any reason why not to. And that turned out to be a hugely significant turning point, and as cliched as it sounds, it changed my life. It was while I was there, and sadly, unfortunately, off the back of other people suffering, because the only reason I went there was because other people had suffered, and that's part of my privilege as a white person, and that was one of the things I started to see that I hadn't been able to see before, the privilege that I have as a white person. And that came out really clearly as I observed how the white expats on the island were dealing with the Nauruans who were on their teams, just this sense of superiority and, of course, being university educated, coming from a developed country, of course we would know better than people who lived on a little tiny island in the Pacific. And I sat down one day with Fatima, who was heading up the Nauruan team for the Salvation Army, and said, this is what I'd been observing. And it wasn't just in other people, I'd seen it in myself. And she said, oh, we know that about you guys, but we just accept it. And that really hit home. It was a bit of a body blow, because here was this beautiful person seeing my privilege much more clearly than I could. And the other thing that I noticed about myself, because this was such a learning curve, having grown up in a largely white Australia, and particularly in my generation, having rarely mixed with anybody who didn't look like me, sound like me, think like me, to be put into a situation where I was working with people of many different skin colours, many different languages, many different faith groups, that really challenged the idea that I had about myself, that I didn't have a racist bone in my body. And I realised that somewhere along the line, I actually did have a latent racism. Somewhere I'd learned that difference was a threat. And so those two things, this understanding that growing up in white Australia, I developed a racism that I didn't realise was there, and I'd started to see my white privilege. And those two things helped me start to understand about unconscious biases, why we think the way we do, and really shaped then the business that I began to build, and which now I use as the underlying driver for curating courageous conversations. Because unless we can look at the things that separate us, look at the strange and wonderful ways in which we think that can separate us from each other, then we can't make the changes that we want to see.
Yeah. Wow, what a story. So interesting, because I mean, for those who do know my story, I mean, I obviously have white skin. My ancestors are from England and Ireland, but I grew up in Africa, and so was the minority skin color, if you like, the minority race, and we actually lost everything due to the color of our skin. And it is so interesting, all of that, how where you grow up and the culture that you're surrounded by and the things that we unconsciously learn from those around us, but also from our ancestors and things like that as well.
Yes. Yeah, it's really true. And unfortunately, these biases, which often have more of a negative consequence than a positive in our lives, they start to develop in us long before we have the cognitive awareness that these things are happening. And so, you know, we can be 3 years old, 5 years old, 7 years old, and we're already learning, you know, who to trust, who to disregard, you know, who to pander to. And some of those things are really helpful because, you know, there are things that we need to know to keep ourselves safe. But too often we are taught to only trust people who are like ourselves and to instinctively distrust or disregard people who are different. And it's as adults that we get the opportunity to choose to be intentional about addressing those unconscious biases and sort of instinctive ways of thinking. And of course, with any choice, we can continue to let those biases rule us, or we can say, look, these are not actually helping me as a human being, and they're certainly not helping my relationships or my decisions and how I make decisions.
Yeah. So I have a question then. Why do you think it is that we instinctively, you know, look at others who are different to us as a threat? Is it a biological wiring? Is it a psychological wiring? Do you have any information on that? Because I would find that fascinating.
It is fascinating. And from my understanding, and look, I put my hand up, I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist. And so I am relying on my own research and the research of others in this. But what I have not only observed, but from the things that I have read from those who know a whole lot more about this than I do, is that it does go a long way back to the days when we literally had to physically keep ourselves safe. And so that whole idea of tribalism, and we had to know who the tribe was to stay safe. Now, you know, so that there is that sort of sense of historical truth to this. I trust people who are like me or who are part of my tribe. I distrust people who are not like me, who are not part of my tribe. So there's that aspect to it as well. I think there's a comfort, you know, the old comfort zone aspect as well, that it is much easier to deal with people who are like ourselves, who think like we do. We don't have to, as I've listen past an accent, because if you're talking to someone who has an accent, we actually have to listen harder. So we fall back into default ways, the easy ways, the things where we're comfortable. And so I think there's those things. Psychologically, we like to make shortcuts. Daniel Kahneman, who's a Nobel Prize winner, he wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, and was one of the earliest people to really start to talk about how people think. And he likened thinking to two ways of doing things. So there was the fast way and the slow way. Fast way is instinctive, judgmental, where we make quick judgments about people and about situations. They're like shortcuts. And then there is the slow thinking, where we take that step back, take a moment to think about whether perhaps that fast thinking is actually helpful for us. So, you know, biases fall into that shortcut way of thinking. where we make a connection from something in our past to something in the present, and we respond or react out of that. But there is the second way, that slow thinking that we can do, which is generally a better way for us to learn about other people and to learn about ourselves.
Yeah, definitely. So because society today is so fast paced and we're all kind of, do more, achieve more, be more, go faster, and we're kind of like running on this crazy hamster wheel. Do you think that that is having a negative effect on obviously what you just explained as fast thinking, because everything's fast right now?
Yeah, I think interestingly, I noted, particularly during the 2020 and 2021, when we were in the deep throes of the pandemic, that biases on so many levels became so much more easy to see. And I think that was because we actually slowed down, which was interesting.
Yeah.
We were locked down, particularly those of us who are in Melbourne. We know exactly what that's like. But I know that there have been other cities in other countries around the world. We'll see, even in China in the last few months, they were still locking down huge cities. So on one hand, we were slowing down, but on the other hand, all our fast thinking, our biases were bubbling up, because often we can keep our biases under wraps, keep them under the surface by, sort of our cultural norms, being kind, polite. But when we're in a crisis, and the pandemic was a crisis for all of us,
definitely,
a lot of that, nice cultural overlays get stripped away, and we go back to our more basic selves. So interestingly, there was these two things in tension. We were slowing down because we had to, but our faster ways of thinking were coming up again. And I think a lot of us have been really confronted by that. I think some of the things that we've seen come out of the United States, whether it was the Black Lives Matter, even the riot at the Capitol building, all of those things, I believe, can only have happened in this time because our biases, we've swung right over to one end of the pendulum swing, have become so clear and so open that then behaviours have responded accordingly. So, yeah, from my perspective, it's been a really interesting time to watch human behaviour.
It absolutely is. I find it so fascinating. I mean, I don't watch the news or listen to the radio or anything because, quite frankly, I find it depressing, but you're still very aware of what's going on around you and also within you, even within yourself, your own family unit, in response to everything that's happening. Now, how would you define bias, Bron?
Bias is simply part of the way we think. And that's one of my goals, has always been to normalise the conversation around it, because, bias gets a bad rap. It's only because it does have negative consequences, but we get very judgmental about our own biases and other people's biases, pointing the finger, saying you're biased. And I want to be able to remove that from the conversation, because it's part of being human. So whether you're white, brown, and any other colour in between, we all have biases. So this is not just a white issue, this is a human issue. So bias is part of the way we think. At essence, a bias is the privileging of one set of ideas or one group of people over and above another, and often to the detriment of that other group of people or set of ideas, where we will ignore them, dismiss them, discriminate against them. Our biases form very early on in the piece, in childhood, as I said earlier, long before we've got any cognitive ability to make assessments about the things that we're learning. Most of the time, they're not taught directly. They come from conversations that we hear, family values, societal values, what's normal, what's considered right, even things like our sporting clubs, all of those things, our governments, the media plays a huge part in this now, but even things like books that you read, because wherever people have an agenda, and most of us do at some point, we have an agenda and we pass it on. I'll give you a funny little example out of my own childhood. I was raised in a very conservative Christian tradition, but as a Protestant, so Presbyterian. My great-grandfather was a Free Presbyterian minister, so that was my heritage. When I was in my teens, I wanted to get my ears pierced, and my mother wouldn't let me because she said only Catholic girls get their ears pierced.
Oh,
now, to me, that made no real sense.
That makes no sense.
No, but for my mum, who was raised that Protestants had the right brand of Christianity, and Catholics, well, goodness me, they pray to Mary and they've got all those idols, and, they can't possibly be right. So we couldn't do anything that even would remotely connect us with being Catholics. And, of course, both my sister and I got our ears pierced as soon as we left home. But, I heard that as a teenager and thought it was stupid, but I still had to comply. That was my mum's bias. Now, did she hate Catholics? No. I'm sure she knew Catholics. It wasn't that she was, overtly nasty towards anybody, but she had been taught that being a Protestant was the right thing to do. Being Catholic was not. And, I couldn't do anything that would be remotely connect me with being a Catholic.
Yeah, and that there's a certain way to be Protestant. You can't be, there's only one path down that. It's a very narrow-minded kind of concept, isn't it? But it happens so often, and it happens everywhere, down to the smallest things. Like there's a right way to drink tea and there's a wrong way to drink tea, and then right up to the huge issues, right?
Yes. Oh, completely agree. Like, whether I get my ears pierced or not is not world changing.
No.
And, won't impact anybody else. So yes, it starts, I think it starts mostly in the minor things, in the little things, and it transfers to the larger things. As I said, like my family growing up, we treated people well. I was told to, the whole do unto others as you would have them do unto you. We lived by that mantra. However, somewhere along the line, I was taught, not overtly, I can't remember my parents ever saying to me, that person's different to you, don't trust them. But somewhere along the line, I learned that.
That message comes across in their actions and their words. You subconsciously understand that, right? You take that on.
You do. And we are so much more conscious now of having, the whole, you can't be what you can't see. So having more women on TV, on boards, having people of colour in advertising, in hosting television programs, having people in wheelchairs on programs in advertising. We understand now that there is no normal, there's no right sort of human, and we are taking steps to redress it. But it's taking a long time, and because unfortunately change is slow. But when I was growing up, you didn't see anybody with a disability. They were all in special schools. As I said, I grew up in southern suburbs of Sydney, so very white, very conservative Bible Belt area. So everybody was like me. If they didn't go to church, they at least sort of believed in God. So it was very monocultural. And it's when we get those messages that says people who are like me are right, and everybody else, well, they're not quite right because they're not like you.
So do you see the landscape currently changing, even, be it slow?
I do see it changing, yes, because, I'm thinking even of advertising now. We are seeing more same-sex couples in represented as heads of families. I'm seeing people in wheelchairs in advertisements. We're seeing different body shapes for starters. That's
Thank
really
God
helpful.
for that.
Oh, goodness me, not all size 8 and 6 foot tall women. So I'm seeing the diversity that represents and reflects the reality of human existence. And I am noticing more the television shows that only have white hosts right across the board, because you realise that when you only have people who are the same as one another, you are going to get a much narrower range of thinking.
Sure.
About even just ordinary world events or community events. You're going to have a much narrower way of reporting on those things. So I am seeing change. If I asked my friends and acquaintances who are people of colour, change is not happening fast enough. There's still too much white privilege and sense of white superiority, and of course so many of our structures and processes still favour white people and particularly white men. So we still have a long way to go in redressing that and changing that.
Yeah, it's still exciting though that things are starting to move. I mean, there's always hope, right? We're taking steps in the right direction, even if they're slow. So that's always a positive. So I know that you work with organizations, small to medium businesses, large organizations, in coming in to consult on bias. How does that work? And what sort of industries are you seeing leaning more towards this change?
Yeah, well, last year I did some work with Tennis Australia.
Okay.
And the thing that came out very much from them, and which I hear so often, is we don't know what we don't know. And particularly in this area. And so what I was able to do with them was run a series, it was still webinars at that stage. We're moving more into getting back into real life situations. But, a series of introductory webinars so that people could get an understanding of what's bias, what does it look like, how does it turn up in the workplace, what are some of the impacts, and, what are some of the first steps that we could do. So I've done that sort of work with sporting organisations, because sporting organisations are coming under the spotlight. Particularly here in Melbourne, we've seen sporting clubs having to deal with racism and sexism, particularly now that we've got the women's AFL really making great strides. So, sporting clubs are starting to understand that, but also even small businesses. There was an architectural firm in Canberra that I did some work with last year. Now, they have probably 60% of women in their staff. Their founder is a woman. And they are aware of, say, gender diversity and how they want to be able to move in that direction. But they wanted to have a deeper understanding of what else can we do? What other steps can we take? What other things do we need to be looking out for? And so, again, being able to take them through just some introductory material to get them thinking, because that's one of the things that I am so focused on, is helping people to start to think about that. That's the slow thinking that Daniel Kahneman talks about, that we can't actually address the biases unless we're bringing them to the surface. What's hidden remains unaddressed, but what we can start to see, then we can address it and acknowledge it and do something about it.
Yeah, fabulous. And you've got a practitioner course coming, a certification course coming out soon. Do you want to share some more about that?
Yeah, thank you, Tarryn. Yes, I have been putting that together over the last 6 months. So drawing on the workshops and presentations that I have been doing over the last 2 or 3 years, because the feedback I was getting, particularly from small to medium business, was it was great to have me come in once, but to have ongoing training, they didn't have the funding. So I thought, well, great, how about I put together a certification program to train the trainer situation so that, they can do the training and then have an ongoing licensing to be able to bring that training to their staff this year, next year, and however long down the track. There are a series of programs in that, so that if they want to just do the first program this year and the next one next year, or do it every 6 months, the timing can then be theirs. And they've got someone who's then trained and qualified to be able to present the information.
I think that's fabulous.
In an intelligent manner.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fabulous. Just like we have a fire officer and a safety officer and an OH&S and an HR person, now we could potentially have bias specialists in organizations to help level the playing field on every level, and just also make us more conscious human beings in general, because it's not just in the workplace, it's within our daily lives, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's so true. And I think one of the things one of my pet hates is those people who just want to tick the box, who go, oh yes, well, I've done the training. Now I've fixed bias. Well, no, I've identified some of my biases, but it's an ongoing intentional journey, because those biases, they are part of the way we think. And yes, we can change some of, neural pathways, things like that. We can do that sort of work, but that also takes time and effort. It doesn't happen overnight, and there's always that the chance that we'll just fall back into our default ways of thinking, which I think really happened during the pandemic. We go back to that instinctive thinking when we're under stress. And so that's going to happen. So to be able to have someone in your workplace who has material and resources at hand, when they start to see maybe particular biases or ways of thinking coming up again, it's not like going, oh dear, we failed. No, we're all just human. We have to be patient. This is an ongoing process, and we just continue to work with it. But having someone who can do that with your staff is such a bonus. And you're so right. We just need to keep it front of mind.
Yeah. And I think the human experience itself is a ongoing journey. And if we are hardwired to have bias, which I think that we are, because it happens on such a subconscious level, it's a continuous work. It's not something that you can, like you said, just tick the box and all of a sudden everything's fixed and it goes away. You may have done one, and then something else on your journey based on your recent experiences comes up. And so you have to then be aware enough as a human being going through your daily life to stop and pause and actually take the time to look at yourself and go, what do I really think? How does this person feel? What's their experience? And open up the floor for those courageous conversations.
Absolutely, Tarryn. And it is always about thinking about what might others be thinking, and staying curious, asking the next question, particularly when we come up against someone who may have presented an idea that all our triggers go off and the red flags are waving, and our instinctive response to that is to get either defensive or on the attack. But the reality is that person has expressed that opinion, not to make a nuisance of themselves or because they're intrinsically a bad person, but because they actually haven't given any thought to, really given any deep thought to that opinion. So one of the questions I often get asked in a training session is, how do I change someone else's biases? It's hard enough working with our own, let alone trying to do something with someone else. But we can stay curious when we hear someone expressing a biased viewpoint that is unhelpful. When they're making comments about someone based on their gender, or, all men are, or all women are, or, on race, all Indians are, or, all Chinese, where we have these sweeping statements that are negative. It's then about asking the question, well, that's really interesting. What made you say that? Because quite often no one's actually ever asked them why they think the way they do. They've probably never thought about that themselves.
No.
And it may go back to an experience that they've had that has been negative with a particular group of people. And so, that's quite legitimate. But then transferring that negative experience to a whole race of people or a whole larger group of people is not helpful.
No,
and it's not right. But they may never have actually been challenged about how they're thinking and how they're behaving towards people that don't deserve to be treated the way that they are.
Yeah. And what I think as well is that they probably have never, that's probably not what they truly think. It's just this big exaggerated kind of easy to make sweeping statement because it's easy, right? It's rather than having to think and look within and do all that hard work, it's like, I'm just going to make this really exaggerated, generalized statement. I mean, humans love to exaggerate, right? Humans love stories, and everyone's reality is just a story that they're telling themselves based on their past experiences, their current situation, and their future expectations. And this is how it all ties together. And they've probably never even thought about it. And I think it's so important to ask, to help change that landscape. If nothing comes of it, at least you ask the question and planted the seed in that person's mind for them to go, actually, maybe I don't think that, or where did that come from? And then they can go on their own journey with that.
That's so true. Roger J. Davies, who's a professor in linguistics, he uses a metaphor which I just think is lovely, because he talks about our biases as almost like a parallel world to rational and logical thought. And I love that idea of parallel worlds that are existing at the same time. So you've got your biases over here, these instinctive things that we haven't given any deep thought to. And then over here, we have our logical and rational thought processes. And I think back to my time on Nauru, where I was confronted with a latent racism. So that was my bias. And on here, my logical thought was going, I don't have a racist bone in my body. So what I thought about myself at a logical level and what my actual body was telling me, because I was feeling afraid, were two different things. So the two things were true at exactly the same time. And I think that is such a wonderful way of looking at these things, because it is a sense in which there are two things that can be diametrically opposed to each other that are true at the same time. And it's about, when we work with our biases, we start to see where they are opposed to what we truly believe in the values that we hold.
Yeah. What I'm also hearing from this conversation is that it doesn't have to be this outwardly like negatively expressed situation like yours. You were like, well, no, I'm not racist. I don't view people that way. So it's not, versus the extreme of white supremacists and all that other sort of kind of thing. It doesn't have to be the extreme. You can just be operating on this kind of almost numb, unconscious parallel universe. It's so interesting. I think that's a great way of looking at it. Thank you for sharing that.
That's all right. I was reading, because I'm currently doing PhD studies looking at the interaction between bias and shame. And I came across, I'll see if I can find it quickly, because I hadn't heard this term before. This talks about the elevator effect. And this is how, like, an African-American dressed in a suit walks into an elevator where a white woman is. He says, I walk into the elevator and she feels apprehension. Her body shifts nervously and her heart beats more quickly as she clutches her purse more closely to her. She feels anxiety in the pit of her stomach. There is panic. There is difficulty swallowing. There is a slight trembling of her white torso, dry mouth and nausea. So her body is telling one thing, while outwardly she's smiling, maybe even saying hello. So I thought that was a wonderful reflection by someone who gets the impact of biases all the time because of the colour of his skin. He notices these instinctive reactions that those of us who are white are giving off, but we don't realise it. And so, you know, in ourselves, we're going, oh, that's okay, it's just a guy in a suit. But our bodies are telling us something different, and that other people can pick that up. So, yeah, it's a very, very interesting aspect of being a human being, that we're operating in these two different ways all the time. And it's, you know, part of my work is not only about raising awareness of bias, but then being able to curate these courageous conversations so we start to talk about it and, yeah, just lose the stigma, because we can't change what we can't talk about.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, anyone who knows me knows that I don't do surface level conversations. So I'm always like, let's talk about that. And they're like, no, let's not talk about that. You know, people are so afraid of those deep, vulnerable conversations. And I do get it. Well, kind of. I mean, I logically get it, but that's just not who I am, right? Now, Bron, you have also written a book. What is your book called and where can people get it?
Okay. So I have written it. It's not published. It will come out next year. So I'm just, okay. And it's called What's Your Water? It's an introduction to bias, because when I first started to get sort of obsessive about unconscious bias, I came across an old Chinese proverb that says a fish is the last one to know what water is. And I love that metaphor, that like the fish swims in water, the water impacts it all the time, but the fish is really doesn't know the water exists. That's the same way our biases exist. And so, you know, I have often at the end of a presentation, when I've used that little saying, I leave them with that question. Well, what's your water?
Yeah.
Because we're allowed us to then question the things that are there all the time, but that we haven't been taking any notice of.
Well, I would love to wrap up our little interview here and leave our guests thinking about what is your water? What is your water? Now, Bron, I am going to pop all of your links in the show notes so people can come and spend some time in your glorious presence, learn from your wisdom, and hopefully start those courageous conversations and look deep within themselves and their environment about their unconscious bias and how close can we marry those two parallel universes together.
Yeah, I like that idea. Yeah, let's bring those two worlds together. That's a wonderful way of thinking about it, Tarryn.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bron. It's been a pleasure, and I know we'll be talking again very soon.
It's been wonderful, Tarryn. Great conversation, great questions.
Thank you so much.